keynote today.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming here today. We have an incredible luncheon keynote, and I get the pleasure of introducing Alvin Warren. Alvin is a member of Santa Clara Pueblo, where he lives with his wife, Pamela, and their children. For over 3 decades, Alvin has fought for the restoration and protection of Indigenous peoples' lands and resources in several capacities, including as his Pueblo's first land claims and rights protection coordinator, as an assistant director of the Indigenous Communities Mapping Initiative, as director of the Trust for Public Lands National Tribal Lands Program, and as an elected and an appointed tribal leader. He has also held several leadership positions in philanthropy, in state government, and nonprofit organizations, and is a longtime farmer who is actively involved in the cultural life of his tribal community. Alvin earned a BA in history from Dartmouth College, and a Master's of Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. So please join me in welcoming Alvin to the podium.
Biagindi kabinawane o chitsantiri na nan dinari mbui heta kinari umbi pare pe okuinu dinari mbui hitung ansha horama sonning hubim muingwa umbi koring yame agingwa hoe pieke agingwe khanapi aging kuninari we hitung ansha ramadi hitung sopavimani hingho. Good afternoon, everybody. I come from Owinga, the village of the wild roses, and the Tewa people of northern New Mexico. And part of our protocol before we speak is we actually ask for permission to speak. So I'm asking if you would give me permission to speak to you today. Kaheng he wa baho nambi nang o chukujo horing tun sigya horing tun sekane ang horing ayin nang nek ha we hogin te hogi hoku ha amiri nek hugi koigi honamo in wege hogi wo meri nek ba honamo in ta honamo wege hogi meri e heri ha we e ko chikoidi wege have o hona wanderi neho na o chukujo hori megi horin sigi ang ivi e hogi mo in waho eda hogi kunda hishjam po waho e tije kang honde hanyi hogin haina en na inda wahamba e tu ha ingi mo ne na o chukujo e ahin kang hui anang hona mo e ta se kane wogin po hang wa hona na dineng to hori poa hap o anyway wa ha hori poa ne nang hona mo hore sa ma e hore san ke abo wawigi tat me po pidi wari boy pikha ma ne nang we ho e honiri ro we we tha ho maramba aki nam binang we o e honiri. It's okay if you're feeling a mixture of discomfort, confusion, maybe even curiosity about what I just said in our Tewa language. Guessing not too many of you speak the Tewa language in this room. But this is actually where we have to start if we are going to truly understand what the land back movement is about. A place of disequilibrium and uncertainty. Because we need to be prepared to challenge what most of us have been taught. The long-held truths that are actually lies and stereotypes. The ignorance that has been cultivated intentionally in the fields of native invisibility. What I spoke about in our Tewa language is our connection to our Earth Mother, who has provided for us since time immemorial. The places that she gives us to go hunt, to plant the crops that feed us, the waters that flow on her. And that in return, it's our responsibility to care for her as she's cared for us. And that a time came that another people came to our lands, and since that time, they've been taking her away from us and keeping us away from her. But we haven't stopped. and we will never stop to try to restore our relationship to her and the places that we know, the place names that we've been given. Now, my tribe, what I just described to you, is only one example among many. Among 574 federally recognized tribes and at least 63 additional state-recognized tribes in the United States, and then countless other individuals who descend from tribes that have not been recognized at all. Native cultures are profoundly interwoven with the natural environment, the plants, the animals, natural features. Added for effect. The location of precious resources, constructed places like villages and dwellings and burial sites. The place names and stories that we have only begin to describe the ways that our communities have influenced and been influenced by these places and place-based things. For countless millennia, we as Native people have retained and conveyed knowledge of place through many things, through our oral histories, our songs, our dances, our cultural pilgrimages, ceremonies, migrations, prayers, petroglyphs, pictographs, and maps made on natural materials such as tree bark and tanned animal hides. We as Indigenous people are our lands. They are our past, our present, and they are our future. Yet between 1776 and the present, the United States has seized some 1.5 billion acres of land from Indigenous people, an area 25 times the size of the United Kingdom. As justification, it continues to rely on something called the doctrine of discovery, which is a principle in public international law dating from the 15th century and rooted in papal decrees issued by Popes Nicholas V and Alexander VI that specifically sanctioned and promoted the conquest, colonization, and exploitation of non-Christian territories and peoples. It asserted that Christian European states could gain title and assume sovereignty over, quote, people they considered heathens, pagans, and infidels on the basis that these lands were devoid of human beings. You heard that right. Remember, this was taking place at a time when there was a debate about whether non-European people even had souls. Now, if this sounds abhorrent to you, it's important to realize this. This doctrine is still in force today and underpins all of U.S. property law. It was asserted by then U.S. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson in 1792. It was enshrined in U.S. law in 1823 in the U.S. Supreme Court case Johnson v. McIntosh, and even cited in 1985 in an opinion written by none other than the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg in County of Oneida versus Oneida Indian Nation of New York, denying their efforts to pursue their Aboriginal land claim. This fundamentally racist principle and beliefs that challenge the fundamental humanity of Indigenous people has been used to do many things. To justify wars of conquest and settler colonialism that has devastated Indigenous nations and communities, to commit genocide, to rip territories away from Indigenous peoples, to invalidate or ignore the rights, sovereignty, and basic humanity of Indigenous peoples, to relocate us from our lands, to impose foreign systems of government, to stifle our native languages, to break up our families and force our children to attend boarding schools or live with non-native families, to decimate the resources that we have depended on for our survival, and to target Native people, particularly Native women, for violence. To complete this colonial process required two things. First, it required erasing our knowledge of who we are through boarding schools and public schools. But then it required erasing us from the minds of the new settlers on our land. So what is land back? At its core, land back is fundamentally about regaining what has been taken from us as Indigenous peoples. In particular, restoring healthy reciprocal relationships between Indigenous peoples and the lands that have sustained us and that have sustained us and that we have cared for since time immemorial. According to Nick Tilson, the president and CEO of Indian Collective, it should be seen more as an abolitionist movement and not as a reform movement. In fact, in the Indian Collective Landback Manifesto, it includes these statements. It is a relationship with Mother Earth that is symbiotic and just, where we have reclaimed stewardship. It is recognizing that our struggle is interconnected with the struggles of other oppressed peoples. It is a future where Black reparations and Indigenous landback coexist, where BIPOC collective liberation is at its core. It involves the restoration of true Indigenous sovereignty and stewardship over land, the restoration of balance and relationality, leading to the revival and strengthening of our languages, knowledge systems, and lifeways. However, landback cannot be fully realized without addressing who actually holds title to land. Because as we've come to learn in Santa Clara Pueblo, for us to be able to have a reciprocal and healthy relationship with our lands under this current land tenure system, and to truly be able to protect it, we have to have title. Now, you may be wondering if the United States has done something to try to right these wrongs to fix the flaws in our legal system. Well, there have been a couple of attempts, neither of which actually comply with international human, civil, and political rights that have been agreed to by the United States. The first was in 1934 when the Indian Reorganization Act was put in place. And one part of it authorized the Secretary of Interior to purchase or exchange land for tribes and allowed for an appropriation for that purpose. However, funds were never appropriated until last year for a total of $2 million. But I'll come back to that. Then in 1946, President Truman signed into law the Indian Claims Commission Act. This provided a very narrow window of opportunity for tribes to assert claims to only a very small portion of our land. And at the end of what for many was a 30, 40-year process, only resulted in paying pennies on the dollar for land taken. When most tribes went into that process to actually regain title, that was actually a remedy that the commission ruled was not within its jurisdiction. In 2002, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights issued a decision that the Indian Claims Commission did not comply with human rights norms, principles, and standards. In 2006, the United Nations Human Rights Committee issued a report finding, in fact, that the United States is discriminating against Indigenous peoples regarding our land rights in violation of the 1966 International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And it recommended that the U.S. should, quote, take measures to ensure recognition of the particular and collective interest that Indigenous people have in the occupation and use of their traditional lands and resources. And then 148 countries, including finally the United States, have ratified the 2007 UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which affirms many things. Among them, that Indigenous people have the rights to lands, territories, and resources that they have traditionally owned, occupied, or otherwise used or acquired. That Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use, develop, and control the lands, territories, and resources they possess, and that countries must give legal recognition of these lands and provide effective mechanisms for redress for any action that dispossesses Indigenous peoples of lands, territories, or resources. This has not happened in the United States. In the absence of this, Indigenous peoples and our allies have had to use purchase and exchange and occasionally legislation to reacquire title or additional rights to land and culturally important sites. For my people, the Kap Ont Oa, we've spent the last 176 years in a continuous struggle to regain and protect our lands. We attempted to do this through court cases, but were thwarted and frankly cheated by a legal system based on that doctrine of discovery that was designed to take, not to restore, Indigenous lands. As a result, we've had to resort to buying back our own land, acre by acre, from small ranches to the 5,046-acre headwaters of our Santa Clara Creek, the lifeblood of our community, which cost over $4.5 million. Were it not for the Lannan Foundation, we wouldn't have had that kind of money. And then we were able to get back 2,500 acres of land that was managed at the time by the Federal Bureau of Land Management that had been declared surplus, meaning the federal government no longer wanted it, in part because it was landlocked between our tribe and the tribe directly south of us. But as much as that should have been a simple process, it required us to get an act of Congress to turn over surplus land. And then in the end, language was added to the legislation restricting our use to traditional use only, whatever that means. So now we only have 56,000 acres of what was our vast original homelands. And even worse, almost 60% of our current land base is actually owned by the United States and just set aside for our use. This is only one example of a growing number in recent years of land and resources being reacquired by tribal nations and where there might not be a federally recognized or state recognized tribe by a native-led organization. In looking at recent examples, there are several common themes. It's usually involving an individual tribe, but sometimes benefits a group of tribes or their descendants. The acreage involved is often small, from 5 acres to 28,000 acres. Sometimes it's part of a legal settlement that involves a corporation that had either benefited from or sometimes damaged the land. It's often paid for with a loan, philanthropic dollars, or tribal funds, but sometimes through a creative mechanism like a state program. It's usually based on a recognition of the unique ability of the tribe or organization to manage the land and resources. Much of the time, it includes a partnership with a conservation organization and the lands being subject to a conservation easement or some similar condition that prevents the tribe from making full use of the land. So I'm going to run through a few examples, and this is just from the last couple of years. 1,000 acres are in the process of being returned to the Onondaga Nation in New York as part of the Honeywell Corporation's settlement for contaminating Onondaga Lake, which is a fraction of the Onondaga's 2.5 million acre original territory. The Passamaquoddy tribe's purchase of the 140-acre Pine Island in Maine. The legislative transfer of 11,760 acres from Chippewa National Forest in Minnesota to the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe. The repurchase by the Yurok tribe in Northern California of 70,000 acres of their original territory over the past decade, which included the tribe taking out a $21 million loan. That's now being paid in part by the tribe's participation in California's carbon cap and trade market. The return of 2,500 acres from Bayfield County to the Red Cliff Ojibwe Nation in Wisconsin, the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa's reacquisition of 28,000 acres in Minnesota through an agreement with the nonprofit Conservation Fund and a loan from the Indian Land Capital Company, the city of Oakland's efforts to return 5 acres of land called Sequoia Point to the Songaria Te Land Trust to benefit the East Bay Ohlone Tribe, Confederated Villages of the Lissaw Nation, and the decision by a rancher named Ernie Figleski to return 9,243 acres of land in Washington state to the original stewards, the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Side note, he was paid $4.5 million for that too. An incremental but still important step toward restoring reciprocal relationships to land involves something called co-management or co-stewardship. This is an arrangement by which tribal nations and people share in the management or stewardship of lands held by federal agencies, states, or others. This has been a big push under the Biden-Harris administration. In fact, on November 15th, 2021, the Secretary of Agriculture and Secretary of Interior issued a joint secretarial order to ensure that their departments and their component bureaus and agencies support shared stewardship of federal lands, including listing various legal authorities that support tribal co-management. I know that Department of Interior officials are actually looking at examples from Australia and from Canada, where those countries are actually further ahead than us in helping land return back to Indigenous management and control. One of the best examples here in the United States is something called Bears Ears National Monument. This involves 1.3 million acres in Utah, where the Bureau of Land Management is legally required to meaningfully engage with several tribes, the Navajo Nation, the Hopi tribe, the Zuni tribe, the Ute Mountain Ute tribe, and the Ute Indian tribe of the Unita and Ouray Reservation on areas including land planning, management, and conservation, while working to protect traditions, quote, that are part of the tribal nation's way of life on these lands, unquote. According to Judith LeBlanc, the executive director of the Native Organizers Alliance, a Harvard IOP fellow who's sitting right over there. So I better get this quote right. Co-stewardship is important because it's an opportunity for federal agencies and tribes to actually learn how to heal often damaged or threatened lands by working together. Yet despite all of these efforts, only a tiny fraction of land that has been taken from Indigenous peoples in the United States has been returned or is under a co-management agreement. In fact, in an October 2021 article in Science magazine entitled Effects of Land Dispossession and Forced Migration on Indigenous Peoples in North America, Justin Farrell and other researchers found that Indigenous people have had 98.9% of our historical lands taken from us, that 42% of tribes in the historical record have no recognized land today. The remainder of tribes have an average of 2.6% of their historical lands, and that land theft has caused Indigenous peoples to have, quote, an increased exposure to climate change risks and hazards and diminished economic value. Now, if this alone doesn't spur us to act in the interest of advancing justice and living up to the ideals this country espouses, we need to recognize that landback is also crucial to the health of our Mother Earth and potentially our survival as humans on this planet. Again, Judith LeBlanc, along with many of us, recognize that the land is suffering. We see in New Mexico and in all states now raging wildfires, floods, drought, and extreme weather events. Restoring land to Indigenous people must be a central part of our solution to the climate crisis. In fact, the World Resources Institute estimated that Indigenous people legally own 10% of the Earth's landmass, but we protect 80% of the planet's biodiversity. In 2016, there was a report titled Climate Benefits, Tenure Costs, the Economic Case for Securing Indigenous Land Rights, which found that if Indigenous peoples had secured land titles, the estimated benefits in ecosystem services, such as reduced pollution, erosion control, and carbon storage, could result in an estimated economic benefit of up to 119 billion for Bolivia, 1.2 billion for Brazil, and 277 billion for Colombia over a 20-year period. And more recently, in 2019, a study in Science Direct found that because Indigenous managed lands have equal or higher biodiversity than protected areas. What does that mean? That means that land managed by Indigenous people has a higher level of biodiversity than the equivalent of our national park system. That restoring land to Indigenous management can actually help countries who are now falling far short of meeting their targets to curb biodiversity loss. At the same time, we can't escape the fact that this massive land theft was a key factor in the vast economic inequities in the United States. Lands taken from Native people often went into the hands of white men and their descendants, including land speculators and agribusiness operators, many of whom, up to the mid-19th century, operated plantations worked by enslaved Africans and their descendants. By gaining free land and labor through land theft and slavery, many white men were able to manipulate two crucial factors of production and amass massive amounts of wealth quickly. I would challenge any economist in the room or listening to try to develop a model to calculate the total amount of intergenerational wealth created through these expressions of white supremacy. But we can glimpse their profound implications by looking at the racial wealth gap in the United States. In the second quarter of 2020, white households, who account for 60% of the US population, held 84% or 94 trillion in total household wealth. Comparatively, Black households, who account for 13.4% of the US population, held just 4%. 4.6 trillion of total household wealth. And for every dollar of wealth that the average white American household has, the average Native American household has 8 cents. We cannot create an equitable economy without addressing reparations for Black people and land back for Indigenous people. With this in mind, is it reasonable for nations to continue forcing tribes to incrementally buy back fractions of land that have been stolen from us? And why must tribal nations be forced to agree to limited use of lands taken from us as a condition of their return? Remember, we're in this situation because of a flawed, indefensible, and outdated premise that Europeans and their descendants have rights to land and resources that are superior to those of Native people. We've arrived at a point, long overdue, where we have to ask ourselves, do we still subscribe to this racist ideology? Since we're attending this conference, I believe we do not. I believe we have the courage to create meaningful, long-lasting structural change. Now, if you agree with me, here are 3 things that you and other allies can do. Number 1, learn and unlearn. Learn about tribal nations and traditional lands where you live, from treaties, from maps, from tribal resources, and even apps that have been created to make it very convenient for us to find where we are. Read the research that's being done now on the subject, including, thank you, Megan, and Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development. If you go to their website, they released a policy brief yesterday that describes a process by which we can identify lands that historically belonged to tribes and that now could be returned by U.S. federal government and state governments back to tribes. We also need to dispel a few myths about absolutes that frankly are simply excuses for further inaction and injustice. I love this one. Whenever I've talked to people about land back, they say, are all non-Native people going to have to move and leave the country? Anybody else heard that? No, not all non-Native people are going to have to leave. When we were struggling and fighting with the Department of Agriculture, the lead counsel in the Office of the General Counsel said, well, if we return any land to a tribe, we have to give it all back. That's a convenient excuse. No, not every inch of land is going to go back to tribes. But yes, we have an opportunity to do right by Indigenous peoples and frankly, help our country and the world. We have to move from a place of panic, anger, guilt, or willful ignorance to a place of responsibility, solidarity, and equity. In school, most of us are taught a one-sided and misleading version of history. And when we buy property, we're made to believe that the land we own, quote unquote, wasn't acquired through violence or theft. We're taught to not talk about colonialism or question how our forebears' ruthless thirst for land continues to devastate Native people. We have to learn and unlearn. But that's not all. We have to take responsibility and act. So I'm looking across this room. Not sure how many of you are land barons or those who are listening online. But if you have land, I highly recommend you find out whose traditional territory your land is located in and donate some of it to a tribe. Or if there's not a current day tribe, to a Native-led organization. Now, if you can't do this, I encourage you to contribute voluntarily to a land tax through a land tax or real rent approach. The Native Governance Center, some of you might have attended the session yesterday, has a lot of resources. They include a resource about land taxes and real rent approaches. One example is called Real Rent Duwamish. I don't know if any of you are from Washington State or Seattle, but it's a voluntary recurring payment made by Seattle residents and others who, quote, acknowledge the descendants of the Duwamish tribe while recognizing that we are visitors on their land who are profiting from being here. You can also donate to or volunteer to support local, regional, and national Native organizations who are working towards land back, like Indian Collective, Native Organizers Alliance, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and many others. In addition to donating land and money now, include the restoration of land or the transfer of some of your wealth as part of your estate planning. Now, we know that many individuals, even those who don't have significant wealth, include their favorite causes and organizations in their wills. For those of us who have benefited from settler colonialism, we should see estate planning as a tool we can use to begin to restore resources back to Indigenous people. As people like Edgar Villanueva have written about, this is a powerful way to use money as medicine. We should also hold philanthropy accountable. In my day job, I work for a foundation, so I'm talking to myself as well. Most foundation endowments and the wealth of high net worth individuals and family offices benefit directly from the taking of Indigenous lands. Yet there is a persistent and recalcitrant underinvestment by philanthropy in Native communities. Instead, foundations must proactively take action to return a portion of those resources to Indigenous peoples. One effort is being led now by Carla Fredericks, the executive director of the Christensen Fund. She, along with the Biodiversity Funders Group and Native Americans in Philanthropy, have created something called the Tribal Conservation Fund. This fund will support Indigenous land acquisition, management, and capacity building, and provide a match for federal conservation funding. Any of us with influence, with anybody in philanthropy, should encourage them to contribute or make a pledge now toward the $100 million goal of this fund, which frankly the United States needs to meet its portion of a pledge it made at the 2021 UN Climate Change Conference, along with 4 other governments and 17 private donors who said they would provide $1.7 billion in total to support Native land rights. We need to make sure not only does that money get raised, but it goes to Indigenous people directly. Finally, we need to advocate for conservation organizations to engage in what I'm calling trust-based conservation. We need to stop requiring tribes to enter into conservation easements or other land use restrictions as a condition of getting our land back, something frankly that's contrary to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Number 3, use your voice and influence to advocate for changes to federal and state policies. According to the Harvard Project Brief, 6 federal agencies currently manage approximately 1/3 of the lands that were within former reservation boundaries. Much of this land could be restored to Indigenous ownership and stewardship. We are in an unprecedented moment with this Congress and administration to do something truly meaningful. We have Secretary Deb Haaland, the first Native Cabinet Secretary at the federal level in US history. We have an impressive array of Native leaders throughout the Biden-Harris administration, and more Natives serving in Congress and in state legislatures than ever before. But they cannot do this work alone. Tribes need to continue to push and advocate, and Americans from across our country, including all of you and those listening, need to lend our voices of support. As a start, hope you write this down. There are 2 bills before Congress right now. One is H.R. 8108, which would allow Indian tribes the first right of refusal on sales of public land and provide for greater tribal involvement in land tenure adjustments. The second is H.R. 8109, which would establish a tribal cultural area system to provide increased protection for important cultural sites. In addition, we need to advocate to amend something called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is the principal source of funding for land acquisition for conservation purposes in this country. We need to make sure that fund is amended to treat tribes as states, which will give tribes direct access to the Land Water Conservation Fund grant opportunities, and require that a certain percentage of land acquisitions using those funds result in tribal ownership. Why is this necessary? Because from 1965 to 2016, less than 0.2% of Land and Water Conservation Fund grants were awarded to tribal nations. 0.2%. Finally, remember that $2 million appropriation that I talked about going to the Department of Interior to support land purchases for tribes? After everything you've heard today, do you think this is adequate? Not a rhetorical question you can answer. No, it's not. In fact, we need to encourage Congress to increase that funding source from $2 million to $14 million this year. This is not an exercise, folks. This is a discussion happening around the FY23 budget right now. The administration asked for 14 million. The Senate is saying 2 million. We need to tell them it needs to be 14 million. But you know what we also need to tell them? It needs to be $1 billion by 2028. Only then will this country begin to get serious about righting its historic wrongs in taking 1.5 billion acres of land from Native people. There are also opportunities at the state level that we shouldn't ignore. In fact, in California, there's a good example where in January of this year, California enacted AB 379 with bipartisan support, which expanded existing laws to authorize the Wildlife Conservation Board to enter into agreements with and make grants to California Native American tribes for purposes related to habitat conservation. But this isn't all. In conclusion, I just want to say that all the things that I just described would help. Some of them would be potentially significant. But nothing will fundamentally change as long as the doctrine of discovery remains the foundation of United States property law. Those of you going to the Kennedy School, this is the true adaptive challenge. It's time for us to join the growing movement to dismantle it. In 2012, the World Council of Churches issued a statement rejecting the doctrine of discovery. Many denominations have also issued statements repudiating the doctrine, including the Episcopal Church, the Methodist Church, and the Unitarian Universalist Church. The Unitarian Universalist Association resolution regarding this is particularly powerful and an excellent model. So I'm going to read a couple of quotes from it. First, it says that the UUA, quote, repudiates the doctrine of discovery as a relic of colonialism, feudalism, and religious, cultural, and racial biases having no place in the modern day treatment of Indigenous peoples. Unquote. The Unitarians resolved, quote, to expose the historical reality and impact of the doctrine of discovery and eliminate its presence in the contemporary policies, programs, theologies, and structure of Unitarian Universalism, and invite Indigenous partners to a process of honor and healing, often called truth and reconciliation, unquote. They encouraged, quote, other religious bodies to reject the use of the doctrine of discovery to dominate Indigenous peoples, unquote, and resolved to collaborate with groups, quote, to propose specific congressional resolution to repudiate the doctrine and call upon the United States to fully implement the standards of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in US law and policy without qualifications, unquote. Only when this happens will we achieve true transformation and be accountable for the land theft that continues to devastate Indigenous peoples and our world to this day.
We have a few minutes.
Very comprehensive and really inspiring talk. I appreciate it. I have a sort of prosaic question, which is about the land that is at the center of this debate. Do you even have a sense of what percentage of it is owned by what kind of stakeholders? I mean, I know obviously it's a little bit of a ridiculous question, but if you were to break it down and say, okay, we want to go for the higher percentage of land that is owned by this government, private companies, citizens, I don't know. Do you even have a sense of how it breaks down and how to kind of, would that be useful as a way to start chipping away at it? Because it seems like such an just massive problem to even conceive of a solution to.
I'm going to encourage a two-part response, including putting Megan on the spot, because guess what research they just did? I will say this using my tribe as an example. We have a very good sense of all of the land, who owns the land that were originally used and controlled. And, you know, the land areas that we went after that I described were strategic because something happened that made it possible to go after those lands. I would guarantee you that most tribes have done some similar analysis and have a very good sense, but that's at a sort of a tribal micro level. So you want to talk about your research?
Yeah. Go to the Ash Center website, you'll see our policy brief, and we're really looking at state and federal parkland as an opportunity for tribes to gain back their land because of these co-management and co-stewardship memos that are in place. And so that's sort of a starting place that we're looking at.
So this is a question from Kim online on Hoover. And she asks that history shows collaborations and support between Black and Indigenous communities during the era of slavery. What opportunities exist today for support and collaboration to further the goals of addressing harms of the past, healing and increasing equity? How can our communities help each other accomplish goals of land back and reparations?
I think, thank you for the question. I think that the Indian Collective is probably the best example of articulating the opportunities around that alliance. And it's not just something that's in the statement that I read, it's in how they operate and in the partnerships that they form. So I think for the person who posed the question, that is the perfect place to go because they're actually doing the work in this way. I wish I could put Judith on the spot. She probably knows more about it. But I think this is something that we need to do more, frankly, in Indian country. I will say that we run a great risk of seeing these two different struggles as seeing either separate or at worst oppositional. And frankly, that benefits those who would want to keep the status quo. So I appreciate the question, and I think that the more that we educate each other about our struggles, the more we can be better allies.
Thank you for your kind words, Alvin. My name is Judith Blank. I'm a citizen of the Caddo Nation, and my formative linguistic years were packing my car in Harvard Yard. So I have a very wicked Boston accent. Now, I think that one of the things that we have to think about is that the struggles and the concerns of the Black community and of Indian country are not special interest issues. The majority of people globally and in this country are concerned about climate change. It makes logical and perfect sense that those who live in cities, which a large part of a majority of Native people do, and Black folks and Latino folks, we suffer because of pollution. We suffer high asthma rates. We suffer from all of the problems that the urban community does. Whereas natives who live on our own land, we're the only peoples in the country who have a collectively owned land base that's been governed since the beginning of time. And so we do have solutions that we can put forward. But unless we convince the vast majority of people in this country to join with us, to be in good relationship with us and the natural world, we're not going to move anything. We've got to move majorities. So I think the relationships between Black and Native communities important, but only if we see ourselves trying to build a majority movement around climate change, a majority movement to making healthcare a human right. Majorities are what are going to make change. And even though right now it is a very fashionable thing to talk about BIPOC, Black and Indian people kind of being the tip of the spear, the truth is that systemic racism plays out time, place, and circumstance. And if we don't begin to act as though we represent the majority, then we won't be able to make any headway in continuing to interrupt the dominant narrative about Indians or Black folks or about how to save Mother Earth.